Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Desert. I am Stephen Toporoff, and I am your worship associate for today. Whether you are participating in person or online, we are glad you are with us. To learn more about us, you can visit our website at uucod.org, and to get on our email list, please write to admin@uucod. That's admin, A-D-M-I-N, @uucod. And before we begin, if you could please take a moment to silence your cell phones, and I will thank everybody for doing so in advance. We good? As we begin today, we acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded lands of the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla people. And we commit to grow in our understanding and relationship with this land and with the people who inhabited it and nurtured it before our arrival. In this congregation, we strive to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You are welcome here, no matter your background, race, ancestry, and culture. We welcome people of all sexual orientations and gender identities, of all ages and sizes, people of all economic statuses and professions, and of all physical and mental abilities. We welcome you wherever you are from, whoever you love, whatever your immigration status or civic engagement. We welcome all those who will learn and grow with us as we commit together to embrace the rich and beautiful diversity of the world and to build a community centered in justice, compassion, and love. We are glad you are here with us this morning. At this time, I would like to take a moment to greet any newcomers or visitors.
Good morning again and welcome. I am the Reverend Ian Riddell, and I have the honor of serving as the minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Desert. It is wonderful to see all of you here today. We are a community gathered not by creed or single belief, but by our commitment to the thriving of the world and our commitments to each other, commitments to work together, commitments to learn and explore together, and commitments to nurture each other. We gather together on the eve of the day that we set aside to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a day to honor his legacy of resistance, his troubling of the waters, and his unrelenting call to create and rebuild in our hearts and our nation in the shape of equity and justice for all. We face a challenge to democracy in these days, a challenge that calls us to hope in moments of despair, a challenge that asks us to persist in the faith that we can and must make a difference. May our flaming chalice, which we will light in a moment, recommit us to truth in our words and our actions, that we may live as we believe all people should live. I invite you now, please, to rise in body or in spirit as we sing together our opening hymn, Come and Go With Me.
screen. May love be the spirit of this church. May the quest for truth be its sacrament, and service be its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, and to help one another in fellowship. This is our aspiration. And I invite Diana Leslie to come forward to light our biopop candles. And as she does so, please read along the words that are on the screen. We light these candles in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as we journey together toward spiritual wholeness. May we, as a beloved community, work to dismantle racism and all forms of oppression. May we live out our principles so that justice, dignity, and equity for all prevail. So a theme for today is voting rights. And I'm going to read about voting rights from a statement from the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. They issued a statement on Tuesday, September 19th, 2023, in favor of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And their statement reads in part as follows. Today, federal legislatures reintroduced the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2023. The Voting Rights Act had a long history of bipartisan support, and this bill merits similar bipartisan support. If passed, the measure will restore and strengthen the original Voting Rights Act. As Unitarian Universalists, we are deeply committed to a profound inclusionary American democracy. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2023 moves us in this direction. For the good of our entire nation, we affirm today that our democracy works best for each of us as individuals when it covers all of our communities in the liberty we want, a liberty that is secured by peaceful means at the ballot box in free and fair elections. A liberty based on participation that includes all of us, regardless of color, political party, or zip code. In our faith tradition, we uphold the inherent worth and dignity of every person, as well as a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We value the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. As a consequence of our principles and our values, we believe that voting rights matter for every person in the United States. We reject the forces of hate and exclusion that seek to deny and dilute our fundamental right to vote, especially voters of color. Our generation's federal legislators must rise to the challenge of this moment and meet their obligations to protect the right to vote. Congress must pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2023. And now, will the ushers please come forward for the collection to support the various programs of this congregation, and thanks in advance for your generosity.
Will you join me now for a time of prayer and contemplation? Spirit of life, source of love, fire of our broken but still shining hearts, we are gathered together today. Though we know we are always with you, and you are always part of us, we gather especially in this community of love, this community of hope, this community of work, this community of possibility. We gather here together this morning. We bring our hearts that are aching and hopeful. We bring our minds that are tired and encouraged. We bring our spirits that are uplifted, though a little daunted sometimes, and our bodies which ache but are still strong enough for the day. We bring all of ourselves here into this place, knowing that the pains and the struggles of life, just as the joys and the triumphs of life, come and go, large and small. They are with us always. And what is also with us always is the love and support of community, the hope and possibility presented by being together with loving faces, carrying hands, sweet voices. So we gather and pause for a moment of gratitude, of humility in the face of love. This love which grounds us, this love which inspires us, this love which calls us to act for justice and hope in the world. And so we pause now together in this beloved place with these beloved people and rest for a moment in that love. May all beings know peace. May all beings know an end to suffering. May all beings know love. Will you join your voices together now as we sing our hymns for meditation, Spirit of Life, Fuente de Amor. Despite being born here in this country, I did not grow up in this country. I grew up in Eastern Canada, and I didn't move to the United States until my early 30s. And even though I didn't grow up here, though, I did end up knowing something of the politics and the history of the United States. People in Canada have no choice often but to know about the United States. We watched a lot of American television in the 1970s and 80s, and so I picked up a lot of things by osmosis. We all watched Roots. We all watched the Iran hostage crisis unfold. We all watched the LA riots and the Academy Awards. Some people even watched American football. And I grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons, that's no surprise, I don't think, including a lot of Schoolhouse Rock. Now, being a word nerd, that was the little short cartoons about all sorts of informational stuff. Being a word nerd, my favorites were conjunction junction, and a noun is a person, place, or thing. But I can also, and I'm not going to do it, but I can also sing the preamble to the United States Constitution, because of Schoolhouse Rock. And I came to this country with an understanding, simplistic though it may have been, of how laws were created and passed in this country because of that little old bill sitting there on Capitol Hill. I was also lucky that my high school offered a course that looked at Canadian and US history in parallel, tracing the similarities and differences of the neighboring countries, how we influenced one another, how our political and cultural systems grew to be so different in many ways. And so I knew how central to the identity of this country was the story of the development of democracy and the broadening, often at great cost and in great conflict, the broadening of the right to participate in that democracy by voting and by sharing and by hearing the voices of those with a broader vision for this nation. And I want to share some of those voices, some of those visions with you today. There are going to be a lot more words from other people than me than usual today, partly because I want to get out of the way of their powerful words, and partly because they actually say some of the things that I really want you to hear. And so I'm a little more of a curator this morning rather than a translator. I hope that's okay today. Late in the fall of last year, the Unitarian Universalist Association shared with congregations resources created by the UUs for Social Justice that Stephen talked about a little earlier for what they called a Power Sunday service in October. A service for our congregations to be united in presenting a message of justice and equity. And we didn't have enough notice in the fall to present the full service on the day that they requested, but our Social Justice Committee, especially Gloria Kapp, and I wanted to share some of their message with you, and so the origin of today's service. When my colleague, the Reverend Peggy Clark, who is senior minister at the Community Church of New York, thinks of what she learned in her childhood about the United States, she remembers learning that this country was the best nation that ever existed. When she reflects on our democracy as an adult, though, she has a more complex understanding. Now, what I'm about to share are some of her words that she created for that Power Sunday service and her permission for UU congregation to use these words in whole or in part, which is why I'm able to share so many of them with you today. She writes, "As much as we like to say we've been a democracy since 1776, or maybe from the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, we've mostly been a democracy in process until the full realization of our potential with the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With the codification of inclusion at the ballot booth, the United States of America became worthy of the admiration of democracies, both realized and struggling around the world. Our system of government," she writes, "standing on a strong foundation of law, had the full support of our nation's people and our institutions, creating what we thought was an unbreakable network, ensuring equal access to our founding promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But as we approach the 60th anniversary of that peak moment, most Americans are aware that our democracy is on a downward slide. The words chaos and dysfunction and infighting have become common in our national headlines as our government grinds to a halt over and over and over again. Strong, healthy democracies require what we call civil society. Civil society consists of all the voluntary organizations where people gather autonomous from the state. These groups might have some state support, funding, or interaction, but they are independent of state controls and they have their own agendas and goals. They're concerned with public ends, but they aren't seeking state power. They exist for many reasons, but one is to influence law, culture, and the way we live together. They are a part of a larger piece of community living, valuing pluralism, inclusion, and a wide range of life experience and thought. The organizations that populate civil society include educators who advocate for curriculum development to train the next generation of thinkers and leaders, climate activists who push against corporate influence, and librarians who ensure access to a diversity of ideas, workers who leverage their collective power to ensure fair wages and protections. Civil society includes museums that preserve our history, dance companies that celebrate self-expression, and community theaters where new philosophies are given language and an audience. Cults are not part of civil society, she writes, because they want to separate people from the mainstream, and yoga groups don't generally qualify because they have no interest in influencing public life. Churches, on the other hand, do. So do all of our Unitarian Universalist organizations like Ministry for the Earth, State Action Networks, or Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. All of these institutions are part of the fabric of civil society with which we don't have an authentic democracy. Peggy talked about voluntary organizations like our congregation and their importance. We can't forget this part of our role in society, the part where we live our values out in the world, where we take what we learn and discern here together and strive to move our society toward more openness, more equality, and more justice. Excuse me. One of the voices in our movement's history who most strongly spoke to us about the power and importance of voluntary organizations, voluntary associations like ours, was a man named James Luther Adams. Adams taught at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago and was a member and leader of the First Unitarian Society of Chicago. He shared a piece of his story and that congregation's history often that has been retold by Jessica York, who is the director of congregational life at the UUA, and the Reverend Christian Schmidt, which goes like something like this. The story takes place about 75 years ago when most faith communities in the United States were segregated racially. Some states required churches to be segregated. Others were segregated because all the other churches around them did it, or because that's just the way things had always been done. We think of our Unitarian Universalist faith as progressive, liberal trendsetters. But in 1948, the First Unitarian Society of Chicago was segregated. It was not the only Unitarian or Universalist congregation that was. The church, the First Unitarian Society of Chicago, is in a racially diverse neighborhood on the south side of Chicago where people of many colors lived, but only white people were allowed to go to the church. One day, a large group of church members started to organize to collect their power and take action against racism in their church. The church's minister, the Reverend Leslie Pennington, and a man, as I said, named James Luther Adams, were ready to move things forward. Adams, among his other roles, was on the church board. Adams and Pennington together made a proposal to the board to desegregate the church. They knew this was the right thing to do. They knew it was what their faith guided them to do. And most church members wanted the church to welcome people no matter what the color of their skin was. But one member of the board didn't. "Your new program is making desegregation into a creed," he said. "You are asking everyone in our church to say they believe desegregating or inviting, even recruiting people of color to attend church here is a good way to tackle racism. What if some members don't believe this?" And so they talked and argued and talked and argued, and eventually everyone became tired and frustrated. But then Jim Adams remembered a piece of wisdom he'd heard. It's best to listen twice as much as we speak. Listen twice as much as we speak. So instead of arguing his point of view yet again, he asked the person who really didn't want the church to desegregate a question. And that question was, "What do you say is the purpose of this church?" Somehow that got everyone's attention. What was the purpose of the church? The board members that Adams had been arguing with thought for a while and then said, "Okay, Jim, the purpose of this church is to get hold of people like me and change them." And that's the story of how the First Unitarian Society of Chicago successfully desegregated. The storytellers, Jessica York and Christian Schmidt, go on to say, "The problems we face here and now in 2024 sometimes seem gridlocked like that Chicago church. Challenges we face as individuals and families, congregations and neighborhoods, and even as a whole country can feel so big we'll never find the way through them. And yet people have again and again found our way through massive challenges, sometimes by making a way when there was none to begin with. Not by bullying one another, not through coercing one another, but by staying at the table, staying in conversation, by refusing to stay quiet when we see injustice, by collecting the power we each have and leveraging that collective power in the service of our faith and values." That question, that Jim Adams asked sticks with me, and I'd love for you all to hold it in your hearts and minds in the weeks and months ahead as we explore this congregation's mission and vision. What do you say is the purpose of this church? We'll come back to that one a lot. And we can look even further back in our history and see and hear the lives and voices of our forebears who lived out their commitment to their faith by seeking to influence the public sphere to change the way our nation treated its citizens. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a poet and novelist, an activist and a suffragette and an abolitionist. She was an African-American woman born free in Baltimore in 1825, and she was, among other things, a Unitarian. Her writing shared the reality of African-American life in the United States before and after emancipation. She didn't shy away from speaking the pain and anxiety of the experiences she lived and saw around her. She joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union, although that was a segregated organization, and was a supporter of the 15th Amendment and a founding member of the American Women's Suffrage Association. Speaking before the World's Congress of Representative Women at the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893, she said, "The ballot in the hands of women means power added to influence. How well she will use that power, I cannot foretell. Great evils stare us in the face that need to be throttled by the combined power of an upright manhood and an enlightened womanhood." Her words of her time. And I know that no nation can gain its full measure of enlightenment and happiness if one half of it is free and the other half is fettered. She worked hand in hand for years with white suffragettes, but she was not quiet about the ways in which white women in that movement refused to see or were able to ignore the impact of their racism on the movement and on the lives of black women and men. She took the opportunity while speaking at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York in May of 1866 to call her allies to task. "We are all bound up together," she said, "in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro," she said. "You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in so doing you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. When the hands of the black were fettered, white men were deprived of the liberty of speech and the freedom of the press. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members." She continued, "This grand and glorious revolution which has commenced will fail to reach its climax of success until throughout the length and breadth of the American Republic, the nation shall be so colorblind as to know no man by the color of his skin or the curl of his hair. It will then have no privileged class, trampling upon outraging the unprivileged classes, but will be then one great privileged nation whose privilege will be to produce the loftiest manhood and womanhood that humanity can attain." She did not mince her words. The rights, those rights that so many people sacrificed to achieve, speaking and marching and protesting and voting and singing and sitting down and demanding, the right to vote enshrined in our Constitution and reinforced in the 1965 Voting Rights Act are being degraded day by day today in our nation, friends. Many states are passing laws and regulations aimed at restricting the rights of citizens to vote. Laws and regulations limiting the hours and accessibility of polls. Laws putting up roadblocks for eligible citizens to legally vote. Gerrymandering of districts to increase the influence of one racial or ethnic group at the cost of representation for others. African Americans, Latinx folks, indigenous peoples, many others, the poor, are facing uphill battles to ensure that they can make their voices heard in our society and our political systems. In the face of these attacks on our democracy and on the whittling away of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that has happened in Congress and through the support of the Supreme Court, This John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act has been put forward to restore much of what has been lost from the original 1965 Act to ensure equitable, fair, and comprehensive voting rights for all citizens. Before you get a little bit nervous, I cannot stand in this pulpit and tell you who to vote for. I cannot stand in this pulpit and tell you which party to support. I can stand in this pulpit and encourage you to support legislation, encourage you to support your values in the legislative sphere. So don't worry about the IRS on this one. We can support movement, we can support ballot initiatives, we can support education, learning, and change. As Stephen shared earlier, we Unitarian Universalists affirm that our democracy works best for each of us as individuals when it covers all of our communities in the liberty we want, a liberty that is secured by peaceful means at the ballot box in free and fair elections, a liberty based on participation that includes all of us, regardless of color, political party, or zip code. So why the John R. Lewis Act? Well, the late John R. Lewis was a civil rights leader and a politician whose whole life was given to ensuring justice and equality in our more perfect union. He was a freedom rider and was one of the lead organizers of the 1963 March on Washington, and he served the 5th Congressional District of Georgia as their member of Congress for 33 years, from 1987 until his death in 2020. He was a living testimony of the power of working for justice. And shortly before his death in 2020, he wrote this in the New York Times about what called him to this service. These are the words of John Lewis. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio, and he was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said, "We are all complicit when we tolerate injustice." He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You may have seen on your way in on a table outside some information and a funny-looking QR code to help you find ways that you can use your influence to support the passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. There's information and the QR code in the order of service as well. If you don't know how to use a QR code, someone will be at the table after the service to help you figure it out. I hope that'll help. There's also more information in our newsletter. Please make a choice to do something. We are called by our values. We are called by our history. We are called by those who came before us to work to ensure that the freedom and rights and dignity of every person, are valued and championed and protected. We are called to act. May it be so. Amen. With that call in our hearts, friends, would you rise, please, in body or in spirit as we sing our closing hymn, We Shall Overcome.
And now, as Reverend Ian extinguishes the flame, please read along the closing words that are on the screen.
Extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
This is usually the point in the service where we have announcements. I don't believe that there are any, but that said, I would like to thank those who are instrumental in putting the service together each week. Joel at the piano, we have our AV team, chorus, and a host of other greeters and ushers, and everyone else who is instrumental in making this all a spiritual and wonderful experience. So I want to thank them.
I especially want to thank the choir this morning. One of my favorite things in the world is to come in early in the morning and you're getting ready in my office and hear the choir practicing. And, oh, thank you, choir. I have to sneak a little science fiction and fantasy in just at the end, friends. Author Terry Pratchett wrote these words in a 1996 novel about one of his main characters. And Susan, that's the character, was bright enough to know that the phrase, someone ought to do something, was not by itself a helpful one. People who used it never added the rider, and that someone is me. But someone ought to do something, she knew, and right now, the whole pool of someones consisted of her and no one else. Friends, the pool of someones consists of us. John Lewis closed his column in the New York Times with these words. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it's your turn to let freedom ring. With this call to action in our hearts, go in peace, my friends, to love and serve the world.